in the country in which you're doing business can divert your company's resources to their own possession illegally, and you should be aware of the laws that are in place that help you remedy that situation, because you may be surprised to find out in some countries there's very little you can actually do about it unless you can directly prove it yourself, and even then there may not be a legal remedy for you. Fraud would be anytime you or somebody that you are doing business with in a country misrepresents the terms of business and or the product they're selling. Again, the remedies that are available vary widely throughout the world depending on which country you're doing business with. And extortion is when somebody actually threatens to publicly shame you because they know some private information about you or your company that would be very bad or detrimental to you or your business's reputation, or even financially ruin you. So this is also what we might call blackmail. And again, like all of the above, what your criminal remedies are really depend on how much the country you're doing business in would even respond to these types of crimes or not. Their local law enforcement or federal law enforcement may either be overburdened and they just don't make time for this because they would prefer to spend their time on crimes against people against that are more violent. But again, you really have to understand where you're doing business and what the customs and traditions and practices are. That might be sometimes different than what you see written. So it's good to establish trustworthy, reliable business partners that you know have a reputation within a community and or nation that are not going to bring forth or lower your risk of these types of things happening to you. And legal remedies that are most commonly available in most nations in the world, but again, not all. And these range from the least costly to the lowest risk up to the most costly and the highest risk. So negotiation is when you and another individual or your company and another private company, you both decide to come to the table to talk. You don't involve any other legal representative or a court system. You just work it out together. Mediation is a little bit more involved, but again, it's still low stakes and low cost. This is when you and a person or a company that you're in conflict with decide to find someone that you both agree is neutral, that will listen to each of your cases or your arguments or your facts and decide and help you both decide how to sort through what the disagreement points are to come to a resolution that both parties may agree on. The next level up is arbitration, which can be legally binding, and again, in some cases, you and whatever entity you're in a conflict with, whether it be an individual or a company, would sometimes be able to decide who is going to be your arbitrator, sometimes not, depending on what the laws are. But this is oftentimes more binding. It could feel a little bit more like a court proceeding in which each side states their case and the arbitrator decides, and whatever the arbitrator decides is what the decision is. And both parties would go into the arbitration understanding that. It may not go their way, but it's binding. And finally, litigation is when you bring the case to court and there's a judge involved. And again, being aware of what legal system you're operating in that case is very important. You, again, would then also have to understand that whatever the decision that came to be that was handed down would be binding. So if you're in a country in which they are more favorable to their own corporations of their nation, you would maybe be able to ascertain that by just doing a little bit of research, asking other companies or people you know and trust how they've experienced any conflict within the country and what seems to work or what doesn't. So again, a little bit of research helps in this area. And with any integrated marketing plan, you would want to surface these issues and address them strategically. And some other important considerations addressed in Chapter 4 are what are the property rights laws? And you might be surprised to know that in some countries there really is no such thing as property rights. Communist countries often have this as a key aspect of them because in those countries the idea there is that everything belongs to the state or the government and everything will be divided equally amongst all because nobody is any better than anyone else, therefore everybody should be able to be cared for equally. That's the theory. And so the idea of anyone owning individual property is not a thing. So make sure you're aware of that. That's becoming less and less common throughout the world, but it still does exist to some extent. And even in socialistic countries, there may also be areas in which the government owns, say, the natural resources of the country, and they don't allow individual ownership over those types of things. So just be aware of that. And even in the United States and certain states, for instance, all beachfronts are considered public property, so that may impact your ability to do business depending on what industry you're in. So it's always very important to be aware of that. And property rights go beyond just physical things. It's also talking about intellectual property, things like trademarks or inventions, those types of patents. Some those things are respected internationally, and some of them are not. And as you may be aware of, the United States and China, one of their biggest conflict points is that the intellectual property rights of American companies and individuals are not being respected by Chinese businesses, and the government does say that this is something they are aware of and trying to address, but it has been a frustration point, and the recent trade talks, and really going back for decades, has always been a sticking point between U.S. and Chinese relations. Advertising regulations vary throughout the world, especially if you're doing celebrity endorsements. Some countries will require proof that the celebrity that's endorsing your product actually uses the product. Truth in advertising laws are also very important. Even in the United States, there are laws that prevent you from saying anything negative about your competitors. So you just really have to be very careful with any marketing campaign or any ads you're placing to know what those regulations are. In the United States, the Federal Trade Commission has laws that regulate how you can advertise. And it wasn't until recently law firms could even advertise in the United States, and that's still the case across many countries. So there are professional services in which it is considered unethical for there to be advertising. So just make sure you're aware of any of those things, depending on what your product is or your service is. Financing is also something to be aware of, or how you go about doing business in other countries. Going back to Sharia law, which is prevalent throughout some Middle Eastern countries, Islamic law has a tenet in which it is unsavory to engage in lending practices. So you need to be aware of the different types of financing options that are in place in those countries that allow people to abide by their faith and also allow you to conduct business. Product standards vary throughout nations, so a good example might be milk or cheese, food products especially. Vitamins, those types of things are regulated very differently in different nations, and that could also have an impact on your product, your ability to distribute it, and how and when you're able to bring it to market could be impacted based on those regulations. And generally, a good tool to look at is the Corruption Index, which is something that's very easy to find. It's updated yearly by several organizations that really help you decide, what is the business climate in each country, and how likely would our company be to have an issue with any of these crimes, and or what could we expect in terms of legal remedies and the reliability that that would be following a rule of law that's objective. Those types of things are all factors in deciding what the corruption index or business climate is in each country. And again, you can find business partners and or markets in any country of the world that are reliable and stable. So this is not something that is a no-go for for every single country, but it is definitely something to be aware of if you're doing business with a country that is known to have a very corrupt business climate. So again, your marketing plan would have to surface that and address it strategically so you could meet your objectives. And lastly, the big one, contracts. What are the laws surrounding contracts, how they're made? And again, civil law countries, this is usually spelled out very clearly, and there's little ambiguity because every little thing that could potentially be in dispute is somewhere written down in a code. Whereas common law countries, you have a little more flexibility to do business that is open to interpretation, which is also bringing forth a lot of risks because what you think might be plain language could be interpreted very differently by another party. And if there is not a meeting of the minds over key things, you'll find yourself in court, which would be very costly. And lastly, every chapter ends with considerations that you need to think about anytime you're conducting any market research or an integrated marketing plan situation analysis. And here are just some questions for you to consider. You can pause the slide here and read them, but you'll also find these and many more questions at the end of chapter 4. Again, when you're doing your group assignment, your research, you're always looking at these variables and how they impact your marketing mix, your product price, place, and promotion, and your ability to reach your target market most effectively so you can reach your stated objectives. If you have questions for me, please do not hesitate to message me on Canvas. Please message me at least 2 days before assignments are due so I have some fighting chance of helping you and making sure you're successful. If you reach out to me when the day something is due, I may not be able to get back to you in time. I'm also encouraging people, if you miss a due date, it's still very important that you complete the assignment and turn it in because most points are better than no points. So please do not get discouraged. Keep fighting. I know life comes up for people. Just please keep communicating me and let me know what's going on, and I'll do my best to be human and make sure you are supported as best as I am able. Take care, and I will talk to you next week.